Eleanor's life had always been filled with motion. Growing up in a bustling family, where five siblings filled the house with noise and energy, she learned early that activity was a constant companion. As a young woman, she would walk miles to get to school, and as a teacher, she paced the halls of her school, her heels clicking against the tile as she moved between classrooms, always with purpose. But after her retirement at the age of 65, when her school days were behind her, the world around her seemed to slow down. The energy she once had felt less necessary, and she found herself looking for new ways to fill her days. In the first months of retirement, Eleanor found herself at a crossroads. She had spent the better part of her life helping others and pushing herself to meet the needs of her students. But now, her role in the world had changed. She didn't have a structure of school hours to guide her days. At first, the quiet mornings seemed to stretch on forever. There were days she lingered too long over breakfast, sometimes turning on the TV just to fill the silence. But it didn't take long for Eleanor to realize that this quiet wasn't fulfilling. It was only making her feel restless. It wasn't until one crisp autumn morning, a little over a month after her retirement, that Eleanor's perspective shifted. That morning, as she sat at the kitchen table, she noticed her neighbor, Miss Thompson, walking briskly down the street. Miss Thompson was in her 70s, yet she had been a regular on the neighborhood walking circuit for as long as Eleanor could remember. It wasn't just the pace of Miss Thompson's walk that caught Eleanor's eye. It was the energy with which she moved, the way her steps seemed deliberate and full of purpose. Eleanor had heard over the years how important exercise was, but she hadn't truly considered it in the context of her own life until that moment. Maybe it's time, Eleanor thought. At first, her walks were short, just a quick loop around the block. But it felt good. It wasn't just the physical act of walking. It was the time she had alone with her thoughts, the stillness of early mornings, the cool air that filled her lungs. For years, she had been accustomed to the hustle and bustle of teaching, of planning lessons, grading papers, and rushing from one responsibility to another. Walking allowed her to slow down, to reconnect with herself. As she walked each day, Eleanor noticed that her mind became clearer, her thoughts less cluttered. The routine of walking seemed to ground her in a way she hadn't expected. But there was more to it than just the mental clarity. Eleanor had read, years ago, an article about how physical exercise could improve cognitive function, particularly in older adults. It discussed how aerobic exercises, like walking, have been shown to increase brain volume in regions associated with memory and learning, particularly in the hippocampus. The article had stuck with her, and as she began to walk more regularly, Eleanor found herself wondering if there was more to the science than she had realized. Eleanor wasn't one to jump into things without doing her research, so she started reading more. She found study after study confirming what she had suspected. One study, in particular, stood out to her. It was from a group of neuroscientists at the University of Maryland who had spent years studying the relationship between exercise and cognitive function in older adults. The results were clear. Regular moderate-intensity exercise, like walking, could significantly reduce the risk of cognitive decline. The studies also indicated that it wasn't just the physical health benefits that were important, it was the impact on mental sharpness, creativity, and memory retention. Is it really this simple? Eleanor thought. For her, it seemed almost too good to be true. She had always known that exercise was good for her body, but this added layer of improving her brain function, her mind, her memory, was the thing that truly sparked her commitment to daily walks. By simply putting one foot in front of the other every morning, she could protect herself from the things that most concerned her about aging: forgetfulness, mental fog, and the fear of losing her independence. As the weeks went by, Eleanor gradually increased the length of her walks. She started with just 20 minutes and quickly found that 30 minutes felt more comfortable. There was something meditative about it. The repetition of her footsteps, the way the world began to wake up around her, the gradual changes in the landscape as the seasons shifted, it all brought a sense of peace. Each day, the act of walking became less about exercise and more about reconnecting with herself. But it wasn't just the physical benefits that made Eleanor stick with her morning routine. Walking gave her a new sense of purpose. She wasn't just moving her body. She was giving herself time to reflect, to set goals for the day, and to appreciate the beauty of the world around her. Sometimes she would listen to podcasts about history or literature while she walked, feeding her curiosity and her need to learn. Other times, she would simply let her mind wander, free from the distractions of everyday life. In the beginning, Eleanor had worried that her age would limit her ability to benefit from exercise. She had heard from friends and family that aging brought about inevitable physical decline, and she feared that it would be too late for her to make a significant impact on her health. But as she continued her walks, Eleanor realized that the science didn't agree with her fears. Studies had shown that the aging brain was far more adaptable than most people thought. It wasn't about turning back the clock, but about actively investing in her brain and body, no matter how old she was. What's more, Eleanor noticed something else, something intangible but deeply significant. She started to feel sharper. Her memory improved, even in small ways, like recalling the names of old friends she hadn't seen in years, or remembering the details of books she had read long ago. Conversations with her family became easier. She no longer felt overwhelmed by new information. Her thoughts felt more organized, and she could focus more easily on the things that mattered most. Her morning walks didn't just provide physical exercise, they provided a mental and emotional reset. Eleanor found that by setting aside time each day to take care of herself, she was better equipped to handle the challenges of everyday life. Whether it was managing a household, staying in touch with friends, or simply organizing her thoughts, the routine of walking gave her the energy and mental clarity she needed. It was during one of these walks that Eleanor had an epiphany. She realized that walking wasn't just an exercise. It was a bridge to a richer, more engaged life in her later years. She thought about how many people she knew, some of her closest friends, who had fallen into the trap of slowing down simply because they had reached a certain age. They had stopped moving mentally and physically, assuming that it was just part of getting older. But Eleanor knew better now. She wasn't letting age define her. She was using it as a reason to invest more in herself, not less. As the months passed, Eleanor's walks became a fixture of her routine. The quiet mornings became her time of reflection, a chance to center herself before diving into the rest of the day. She found joy in the simple act of walking, in feeling the sun on her face and the breeze in her hair, in knowing that each step was a step toward better health. Not just physical, but mental too. One day, as she walked through the park, she saw Miss Thompson again. The older woman was walking at the same brisk pace as always, her eyes scanning the horizon. Eleanor smiled to herself, grateful for that moment of inspiration months earlier. She had learned that keeping her body in motion was just as important as keeping her mind sharp. By incorporating a simple habit into her life, Eleanor had given herself a new lease on the aging process. Walking, once a basic activity, had become a lifeline. It wasn't just the science that had convinced her. It was the way she felt. Stronger, more present, more connected to herself and to the world around her. And, perhaps most importantly, it had made her feel young again. As she looked ahead, Eleanor knew one thing for sure. Her morning walks were far from just a habit. They were a key to a healthier, more vibrant future. Eleanor's transformation after her retirement wasn't just about walking or staying physically active. It was about rediscovering her passion for knowledge. For as long as she could remember, learning had always been a central part of her life. From the moment she could read, books were her escape, her source of inspiration, and the gateway to new worlds. As a teacher, she had made it her life's mission to ignite that same spark in her students. But now that she no longer had a classroom, the question arose, what would keep her mind sharp and engaged? It didn't take long for Eleanor to realize that the answer was staring her in the face all along: reading and lifelong learning. For many years, Eleanor had been so absorbed in the act of teaching that her own personal reading often took a back seat. Most of her time was spent preparing lesson plans, grading papers, and mentoring students. She hadn't had the luxury of curling up with a book for pure pleasure in years. and that realization hit her with a strange sense of loss. The books on her shelves, once read and enjoyed, now seemed like distant memories. Their spines had collected dust as life moved on, and they were waiting for her to rediscover them. The first step in Eleanor's new intellectual journey was simple. She picked up a book, a novel she had read years ago, a historical fiction piece set during the time of the Roman Empire. The opening pages felt oddly familiar, but it was as if she was reading it for the first time. There was something about the story that drew her in, a level of detail she hadn't fully appreciated before. She could tell that the years of teaching and reading academic texts had shaped her perspective. The historical context of the story, the intricate relationships between characters, and the cultural nuances that had once slipped under her radar now stood out in sharp relief. Eleanor couldn't put the book down, reading long into the night as the words took her on a journey back in time. The experience was exhilarating. The fact that she had the time and freedom to engage in a book without interruption filled her with a sense of contentment. For the first time in years, Eleanor felt like she was learning again, on her own terms, not as part of a curriculum or a lesson plan. Soon, she began to feel the same joy from reading that she had felt as a child, when books were the key to unlocking the wonders of the world. She began to read widely, picking up everything from classic literature to contemporary science books. She sought out fiction, history, biographies, and even self-help books. Every genre seemed to offer her something new. What had once been a quiet passion, buried beneath the demands of her job, had now come to life again in full force. But Eleanor's learning wasn't limited to reading alone. She had always believed that the pursuit of knowledge shouldn't be confined to books. After all, the world was full of opportunities to expand one's horizons. Eleanor realized that the information available through the internet and online resources could be just as valuable, if not more so, than the books on her shelves. She decided to take a step into the digital world. She started by subscribing to a few online courses. There were subjects she had always been curious about: psychology, ancient civilizations, astronomy, and now she had the time to explore them. At first, the idea of online learning felt a little daunting. Technology had changed since her teaching days, and she wasn't entirely sure she would be able to keep up. But Eleanor wasn't one to back down from a challenge. She took a deep breath, sat down at her computer, and signed up for a course on ancient Greek philosophy. The first lesson was an eye-opener. The professor's voice, soothing yet authoritative, led her through the principles of Socratic questioning and the ideas of Plato and Aristotle. The material wasn't just fascinating. It was challenging in ways that made Eleanor's mind stretch and grow. She found herself taking notes, asking questions, and contemplating the deeper meanings of life, just as she had done with her students during her teaching career. The idea that learning could be a lifelong pursuit, something that didn't stop when you left the classroom, felt incredibly empowering. As the days passed, Eleanor's intellectual curiosity only grew. She signed up for more courses, each one opening a new window to the world. She learned about the intricacies of human behavior in a psychology class and studied the history of the Renaissance. She took a deep dive into the mysteries of the cosmos in an astronomy course. Every class, every new piece of information felt like a small victory, as though her mind was being revitalized with every lesson. But it wasn't just about the academic knowledge she was gaining. It was about the way she was learning to think again. As a teacher, Eleanor had always encouraged her students to think critically, to question the world around them, to never stop asking why. Now, she was applying that same approach to her own life. Reading and learning were no longer just passive activities. They were active processes that demanded her full attention and engagement. Eleanor wasn't just absorbing information. She was synthesizing it, applying it to her own life, and seeing connections between disparate ideas. There was something deeply satisfying about this process. Eleanor began to notice that her cognitive abilities had improved in ways that went beyond her reading. Her memory, once prone to forgetfulness, became sharper. She could recall facts and figures more easily. Her ability to make connections between ideas, whether in conversation or in her own writing, became more fluid. She started to feel a sense of pride in the way her mind was working. One evening, after finishing an audiobook on the history of the French Revolution, Eleanor found herself discussing the ideas of Jean-Jacques Rousseau with her son, Michael, who had been a political science major in college. Michael had always been an avid debater, and in the past, Eleanor had often felt that he was the expert while she was the eager listener. But this time, their conversation felt different. Eleanor found herself contributing ideas about the role of individual freedom in society, ideas she had only recently encountered but now felt equipped to discuss. Michael was impressed, and that moment of intellectual connection left Eleanor with a deep sense of accomplishment. She had bridged the gap between her formal education and her lifelong pursuit of learning, and the result was both humbling and exhilarating. Eleanor's thirst for knowledge didn't stop at reading and online courses. She also joined local community groups that focused on cultural and intellectual discussions. She became a regular at the monthly book club at the local library, where she would engage in spirited discussions about everything from contemporary literature to world politics. These gatherings not only kept her mentally sharp, but they also introduced her to new perspectives. She loved the diversity of ideas, the challenges that came with listening to viewpoints that differed from her own, and the way her understanding of the world expanded with each conversation. In fact, one of the unexpected benefits of this new phase of learning was the way it improved her social life. Many of Eleanor's friends and family had remarked that she seemed younger, more vibrant, and more engaged than they had seen her in years. Some of them were inspired to pick up a book or enroll in a course themselves. Eleanor had become a kind of role model, showing others that it was never too late to start learning, to grow intellectually, and to expand one's horizons. She was living proof that a curious mind could remain sharp and active well into old age. The more Eleanor read, learned, and connected with others, the more she understood the true value of lifelong learning. It wasn't just about improving cognitive function or protecting against memory loss. It was about keeping the mind alive, curious, and engaged. In a way, learning had become a form of self-care, a way to nurture and protect her mind as she aged. It was a way to stay present, to ensure that her life didn't become stagnant or dull. And in the process, Eleanor had discovered a new sense of joy and purpose that transcended her teaching career, her retirement, and even her daily routines. Her love for learning had never been a destination. It was a journey that she now knew could last a lifetime. Each book, each course, each conversation was a step along the way, a way to keep her mind sharp and her spirit youthful. As Eleanor sat back in her favorite armchair, a cup of tea by her side, and a new book in her hands, she realized that the pursuit of knowledge had become her greatest adventure yet. For Eleanor, the transition into retirement wasn't just about finding new hobbies or filling up her free time. It was also about redefining what it meant to be connected to others. After decades of teaching, she had been surrounded by students, fellow teachers, and colleagues. Her days had been filled with conversations, discussions, debates, and moments of collaboration. But once she stepped out of the classroom, the whirlwind of interactions slowed down significantly. At first, the silence of her empty home in the early mornings and the lull of long afternoons left her with a feeling of isolation that she wasn't used to. It wasn't loneliness in the traditional sense. It was more the absence of meaningful connection, the absence of those intellectual conversations that used to spark her interest, provoke new thoughts, and keep her mind alive. Eleanor knew that maintaining social connections was critical, especially as she grew older. The research she had come across in recent months echoed what she had intuitively known all along. A lack of social engagement could be detrimental to both mental and emotional health. It wasn't just about having a cup of tea with a friend every so often or catching up with family during holidays. Meaningful conversations, the kind that challenge our thinking, make us laugh, or share something of value, were essential in maintaining cognitive function and emotional well-being as people age. At first, Eleanor tried to reach out to old friends, colleagues she had worked with during her teaching years, old neighbors, and even distant family members. It wasn't always easy. Some had moved away, and others seemed to be caught up in their own routines. Eleanor, however, wasn't deterred. She realized that just as she had to make an active effort to start walking again for her physical health, she had to make a similar effort to reconnect socially for her mental health. She couldn't wait for opportunities to come knocking at her door. She had to create them herself. One of the first things Eleanor did was start a weekly coffee and conversation group at the local library. It wasn't a formal club, just an informal gathering where anyone who wanted to come could meet up for an hour or so, chat about books, current events, or anything of interest. She put up flyers in the neighborhood and on bulletin boards, hoping to attract a diverse group of people. At first, only a handful of people showed up: a retired nurse named Claire, a recently widowed gentleman named Robert, and a couple of other local retirees. But slowly the group grew. More people started attending, drawn by Eleanor's warmth and the promise of lively conversation. At first, the conversations were a bit slow to get off the ground. People were hesitant to share their opinions, not quite sure what kind of dialogue Eleanor was hoping to spark. But over time, the group found its rhythm. Eleanor encouraged everyone to share something they had recently read, something that inspired them, or something they had learned. She also made sure that everyone had a chance to speak. Slowly but surely, the coffee table discussions became richer and more dynamic. Claire, the retired nurse, shared fascinating stories about her years working in emergency rooms, offering insights into the human condition that Eleanor had never considered. Robert, the widower, often talked about his travels, reminiscing about the places he and his wife had visited together and how travel had shaped his perspective on life. They spoke not just about their individual experiences, but about global events, the challenges of aging, and how society's understanding of various issues was changing. Eleanor was delighted. The conversations weren't just about small talk or trivialities. They were intellectually stimulating, a delightful blend of personal anecdotes, historical context, and philosophical musings. But it wasn't just the intellectual stimulation that Eleanor cherished. It was the emotional connection, the way these conversations made her feel part of a community again. She realized that talking about meaningful topics, about what mattered to each person, about ideas that sparked passion or curiosity, helped create a sense of belonging, a sense of shared experience. These discussions not only kept her mind sharp, but also provided a deep sense of fulfillment that she hadn't realized she was missing. Eleanor found that the act of engaging in these conversations improved her emotional health as well. It was easy to slip into isolation when you were no longer tied to a job or a routine. There were days when she felt like her world had shrunk, but as she began to reconnect with others, she noticed that her sense of purpose returned. These conversations gave her a reason to wake up in the mornings, a reason to leave her home and participate in something that nourished her soul. She also began to notice the positive effects it had on her memory. Listening to stories, recalling facts from history, debating different viewpoints. All of this required a level of mental engagement that kept her brain in good shape. The group, once small, began to grow even more. New faces showed up each week, some elderly, some younger. One of the new members, a young woman named Lydia, who had recently moved to the area for work, was particularly eager to contribute. Lydia was an anthropologist, and her research often focused on human behavior in different cultures. Her insights into the psychology of communication and human interaction were nothing short of fascinating. It wasn't just her academic knowledge that intrigued Eleanor. It was the way Lydia approached every conversation as a learning experience. Eleanor realized that, through conversations with people of all ages and backgrounds, she was not only maintaining a vibrant intellectual life, but also learning new things she would never have encountered in her usual reading. Soon, Eleanor found herself drawing on these conversations in her own life. Whether she was talking with her family over dinner or discussing a current event with a friend on the phone, she was more engaged, more informed, and better equipped to hold her own in discussions. She found that she was able to recall details from history or literature, offer her own perspectives on complex issues, and, most importantly, remain open to hearing and understanding ideas that differed from her own. But Eleanor's efforts to build social connections didn't stop there. She also began to prioritize spending more time with her family. Her son Michael, whom she had always been close to, became a regular dinner companion. Over the years, their conversations had been mainly about daily life, work, family updates, and occasional political debates. But now, Eleanor sought to deepen their discussions. She encouraged Michael to share his views on topics she was reading about or learning in her online courses. She found herself asking him questions not just as a mother to her son, but as an equal, eager to learn from his insights. On one particularly memorable evening, after a long discussion about the effects of social media on modern communication, Michael said, "You know, Mom, I'm really impressed. I thought you were just going to read the books and then forget about them, but you're actually thinking critically about everything you read and hear. You've really changed." Eleanor smiled, a sense of pride swelling within her. "I think the world keeps changing, Michael," she said, "and I want to keep changing with it. Otherwise, what's the point?" Michael looked at her with a mix of admiration and wonder. He had always respected his mother, but he was now seeing a side of her he hadn't fully appreciated before. Her intellectual curiosity was infectious, and he found himself thinking more deeply about his own life and the conversations he had with others. It wasn't just Eleanor who was benefiting from these discussions, it was everyone around her. Her social connections expanded beyond her immediate circle. Eleanor also volunteered at a local community center where she interacted with a diverse group of people. She taught a small writing class, helping others to tell their stories, to put their experiences on paper. These interactions were an opportunity for Eleanor to engage with people of different ages, backgrounds, and perspectives. Every person had a unique story to tell, and every conversation offered her something new. It was a reminder that meaningful social connections didn't just revolve around friends or family. They could be made anywhere, with anyone who was willing to share a part of themselves. Through these interactions, Eleanor began to realize that the quality of social connections was just as important, if not more so, than the quantity. It wasn't about having hundreds of acquaintances or attending every social event. What mattered was creating relationships that were deep, thoughtful, and intellectually stimulating. The more Eleanor engaged with others on a meaningful level, the more she understood the profound impact that these interactions had on her mental and emotional health. It was in these conversations, whether with friends at the library, her son over dinner, or a new acquaintance at the community center, that Eleanor found the true essence of connection. Her life had become richer, more complex, and more satisfying because of the relationships she had nurtured and the discussions she had engaged in. These conversations, filled with curiosity and care, weren't just good for her health. They were the very fabric of the vibrant, engaged life she had always hoped for in her retirement. After a few years of embracing the small, yet meaningful changes in her life, Eleanor began to notice something profound. Her daily routine had shifted from a life of routine leisure into one filled with intellectual stimulation, physical movement, and vibrant social connections. Yet, despite all of these positive changes, something was still missing. She felt her mind sharp and her body stronger, but there was a sense of emptiness that lingered beneath it all. This emptiness was not due to a lack of activity or engagement, but stemmed from an inner desire to contribute, to use her experiences, wisdom, and talents in a way that would positively impact the world around her. It was a yearning for a sense of purpose, a deeper mission beyond personal growth and the exploration of her own interests. For Eleanor, the idea of giving back had always been a natural extension of her character. As a teacher, her life had been spent imparting knowledge to others, encouraging her students to think critically and challenge their own assumptions. She had found meaning in those moments of shared discovery, in the way her students would light up when they grasped a difficult concept or felt motivated to pursue their passions. But teaching in a formal classroom was no longer an option for her. So, Eleanor began to reflect on how she could still provide guidance, mentorship, and support to others outside the traditional structure of education. One afternoon, while walking through the local park, Eleanor passed by a volunteer center. It was a humble building nestled between a bookstore and a coffee shop, but it stood out because of the vibrant sign outside. "Volunteer with us. Your community needs you." She had walked by this sign hundreds of times over the years, but on this particular day, something about it felt different. A sense of urgency washed over her, like a subtle nudge from within. Without much thought, she crossed the street and entered the building. Inside, the walls were covered with bulletin boards listing various volunteer opportunities. Everything from tutoring at-risk youth to helping at animal shelters, from providing companionship to seniors to working with immigrant families. The options were diverse and varied, but what stood out to Eleanor was the description of a program that offered mentorship to high school students. They were looking for experienced individuals who could help guide young people in making decisions about their futures, whether it was related to college applications, career choices, or personal development. Eleanor's heart skipped a beat. This was it. This was the opportunity she had been waiting for. It combined her love of teaching with the desire to make a real difference in the lives of others. She signed up that very day, excited by the prospect of connecting with young people again. It felt like a natural progression. After all, mentoring wasn't all that different from teaching. The role was about providing guidance, offering insights, and helping others discover their potential. She was eager to return to the classroom, though this time, the classroom was more about one-on-one interaction than formal lectures. Eleanor's first meeting was with a young girl named Sophia. Sophia was 16 years old, an intelligent but somewhat withdrawn teenager who had recently moved to the area with her family. She had a quiet demeanor, often keeping to herself, but Eleanor could tell there was more to her than met the eye. The first few sessions were tentative, as the two of them navigated the boundaries of their new relationship. Eleanor took things slow, starting by listening to Sophia's story, her challenges, dreams, and struggles. It didn't take long for Eleanor to realize that Sophia wasn't just seeking academic guidance. She wanted someone to talk to, someone who could help her figure out what kind of person she wanted to be in the world. The pressure of choosing a college, deciding on a career path, and figuring out her future were all weighing heavily on Sophia's shoulders. But it wasn't just the external expectations that were difficult to manage. It was the internal battle, the feeling of being lost in a world that demanded certainty when she herself was unsure of what she truly wanted. Eleanor understood this feeling more deeply than Sophia could have known. She had been young once, full of questions and uncertainties, and though her own journey had been shaped by education and experience, the emotional roller coaster of growing up never left her. She shared stories from her own youth, about the pressure she had felt, the challenges she had faced, and the people who had mentored her along the way. With each conversation, Sophia began to open up more, sharing her fears, her hopes, and her dreams. It became clear to Eleanor that her role wasn't just to give advice. It was to be a sounding board, a safe space where Sophia could explore her emotions and ideas without fear of judgment. As the weeks passed, Eleanor grew more invested in her role as a mentor. She helped Sophia with her college applications, but more importantly, she helped her navigate the complex landscape of her emotional world. They talked about self-worth, the importance of resilience, and the courage to face challenges head-on. Eleanor found herself drawing on her own life experiences in ways she hadn't anticipated. The work wasn't just fulfilling, it was life-affirming. Sophia's growth, her quiet transformations over the months, filled Eleanor with a profound sense of purpose. She could see the subtle changes in her mentee, the way she stood a little taller, spoke with more confidence, and began to embrace the future instead of fearing it. But Eleanor's impact didn't stop there. As the months wore on, she found herself mentoring other students as well, each one with their own unique story, fears, and aspirations. She worked with Liam, a bright but troubled young man who had struggled academically due to personal challenges at home. With patience and encouragement, Eleanor helped Liam develop study habits, learn to organize his thoughts, and regain his confidence. There was also Maya, a shy girl with a passion for art, but no idea how to turn it into a career. Eleanor helped Maya create a portfolio and guided her through the process of applying to art schools. Each of these students taught Eleanor as much about herself as she taught them. Through every session, every breakthrough, every challenge overcome, she discovered a deeper well of wisdom and compassion within herself that she hadn't known existed. The work was hard, often emotionally taxing, but it was also deeply rewarding. Eleanor began to feel a profound sense of connection to the world again, as though she were part of something larger than herself. She realized that her role as a mentor wasn't just about helping young people succeed academically. It was about helping them discover who they truly were, their potential, and the paths they could take to live fulfilling lives. The act of giving back had filled the gap she hadn't even known was there. It wasn't just about her own learning or growth anymore. It was about shaping the future by guiding and supporting others. One day, at the end of a particularly meaningful session with Sophia, the young girl turned to her and said, "You've really made a difference in my life. I don't think I'd be where I am without your help." Eleanor was taken aback. She had never expected such a direct acknowledgement of her impact. But it wasn't the praise that moved her. It was the realization that, in some small way, she had played a role in helping a young person find their footing in a world that could often feel overwhelming. As Eleanor continued to volunteer and mentor, she saw her own sense of purpose expand. It wasn't about a grand mission or a single moment of clarity. It was the accumulation of small, meaningful actions. It was the joy of seeing others grow, of knowing that she had played a part in their journey. The act of mentoring was not just a gift she gave to her mentor, but a gift she received in return. It reminded her of her value, her place in the world, and her continued ability to contribute. Her family, too, began to notice the difference. Michael, her son, remarked how vibrant she had become. "You found your groove, Mom," he said one evening as they sat down for dinner. "You seem more fulfilled than I've seen you in years." Eleanor smiled. He was right. The satisfaction she had once derived from teaching and educating now came from something much deeper, the ability to shape lives in ways that transcended the classroom. In the quiet moments, when she reflected on her journey, Eleanor realized that her late-stage life was not just about filling the hours with activities or chasing the illusion of endless youth. It was about living with intention, about engaging with the world and the people around her in ways that gave both her and others meaning. It was about the joy of giving, of passing on knowledge, and of making a difference, even if only in small ways. Eleanor had found a purpose that filled her heart with fulfillment and kept her mind sharp and engaged. It wasn't just about the years ahead. It was about making each one count, each day meaningful. And as she sat at her desk, writing her final letter to Sophia before the young girl graduated and moved away to college, Eleanor realized that her journey was far from over. There would always be someone to mentor, something new to learn, and a life to touch with her wisdom, experience, and heart. She smiled, content with the knowledge that in giving back, she had truly found herself.